Background is that I'm a radiation scientist. I'm an expert because I've studied this issue for 20 years on the health effects of radiation. And because I've studied it for 20 years, I have recognized that there are differences in the different kinds of radiation that people are exposed to. And this is now a very big issue in the world, this issue of the types of radiation. And so you will find the military and the United States and organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency and the World Health Organization, they model the effects of radiation on the survivors of the Hiroshima atomic bomb. And this is the baseline for all studies of radiation and health. And whilst that study is fine for external radiation, because that's what these people were exposed to, it's very mistaken when it's used to examine the effects of internal radiation. This is substances which get inside the body, because these substances create local effects. So in other words, the methods that they use for explaining how radiation is safe in the case of depleted uranium in weapons, and the way in which they can continue to use depleted uranium weapons, is because they employ this incorrect risk model which averages the energy over the whole of the body. That's the most important thing that in this whole area. And that's why it's been possible for the military of the world to start using this weapon, depleted uranium. Of course, the problem is that depleted uranium, when it hits its target, it creates lots of little particles of uranium, very small, smaller than the human cell. And these particles can get inside the human cell. Now, this has never happened in the whole of evolution. Although uranium is a natural substance and has existed on Earth for the whole of the millions of years that life on Earth has evolved, never in that entire period of evolution has there been in the air microscopic nanoparticles of uranium. That has never existed. The first time that happened was in this last century. And as far as uranium is concerned, the first time that happened was probably in the 1991 war in Iraq, when these weapons were first used. Now, nobody denies that these weapons are fantastically good as weapons. As weapons, they destroy tanks. I've been in Iraq and I've seen the tanks that have been destroyed. And these were weapons that were initially deployed for winning tank battles. So that the big war in Iraq was won because of depleted uranium weapons. But by the time it got to 2003, I believe that a new generation of uranium weapons has been developed, which was not weapons for armor, but were weapons for fighting in towns, for anti-personnel weapons. And the reason I believe this is that there have been measurements made by myself and other people in various war zones of the world and in Iraq of the soil contamination around the weapon craters, places where these weapons were used. And when you look at these contaminations, you find that you don't have depleted uranium there, but you have enriched uranium. This has turned up again and again and again, and it turned up in the Balkans too. And also, as well as this, there have been associated with this reports of the new kinds of casualties. So people have been killed in these wars, and nobody knows how they've been killed. There are no obvious wounds, but they're dead. And there's sometimes a limb becomes damaged, and then normally they would amputate the limb, but in this case the person dies. There's no reason for the person to die, the person dies. Now, to me, because of my history of understanding the effects of ionizing radiation, all of this points to the possibility of some sort of radiation weapon. Possibly just depleted uranium, or possibly just enriched uranium, or natural uranium. But the question has to be asked, why are we finding enriched uranium? Because it's a very valuable stuff. I mean, to just use enriched uranium as a bullet would be like shooting your enemy with diamonds, because it costs a very great deal of money to make enriched uranium. So we think that there is a new weapon out there, and that it's some kind of thermobaric weapon, that it involves quite a small charge, so it can be fired from the shoulder, and that it leaves a contamination signature of enriched uranium. And it may in fact be a new type of atomic weapon, because a number of physicists that I've spoken to about this have been predicting for a long time the possibility of making a weapon that uses deuterium and hydrogen dissolved in uranium, which then causes a fusion, like in the sun. This is how the sun works. You get a fusion reaction, and people are trying to do fusion in CERN and all over the world. They're trying to make nuclear power with fusion. But this is a low-yield fusion device which produces enriched uranium and causes an emission of neutrons and gamma rays and very short-lived isotopes. So, for instance, in one of these craters we found high levels of radiation, but they decayed away very quickly. So inside 2 or 3 weeks they'd gone. Anyway, that's the start of it. What I really came to talk to you about here was my findings in Fallujah. I've studied, as an epidemiologist, quite a few small areas where people have been exposed to radioactivity, particularly in England anyway, near nuclear sites. And so I've developed a method for examining the epidemiology of small areas, because you must know that the cancer registries will not release small area data. So although cancer registries collect data all over the world, here in Geneva, in Sweden, in Finland, in the United Kingdom, everywhere, they will only release data to very large areas, to the size of a country. And the argument always is that it is a question of personal confidentiality. But my belief is that it's not a question of personal confidentiality, it's a problem associated with looking at small areas. Because once you are able to look at small areas, you can actually identify the source of anything that you might find. So if you get released official data to a small area, and that area is near some plant that produces some bad chemical, or a nuclear site that produces radiation, you can then accuse those people of contamination and so on. Anyway, in order to get around this problem with the cancer registries, we developed this small area study methodology, which works. It's pretty accurate. We tried it out in about 5 or 6 places in England. And so we applied this to Fallujah, because many people have been saying on the television and the internet all over the place that there was a huge increase in cancer in Fallujah, and birth defects and deformities and generally the kind of thing you would expect to find if someone was exposed to some radioactive material. And we've heard this in Basra also, and in other parts of Iraq. But nobody has ever done a proper epidemiological study. So my colleague Malak, who asked me about this, I said, yes, we can do this study. You have to recruit some people that you trust in Fallujah, and I'll create a questionnaire, and you have to go and knock on doors in about 700,000 houses, and you ask them who lives there, how old they are, what the sex is. So you get a base population, so you know the number of people of ages and sexes in your study group. And if it's a big enough study group, then statistically it becomes a representative sample of the area. That's how you do epidemiology in these third world countries where you don't have official cancer registries. So it's an old-fashioned method, but it works. So we did this, and we did it very quickly. And then shortly towards the end of it, then there were some problems that the Iraqi government then said that this study was being carried out by terrorists, and anyone who was involved in it would be arrested. But we had already done it by then. It was published in a peer-reviewed journal. It had four referees, so it's a proper peer-reviewed study. And the referees were very helpful. They suggested various things, which we did. So we went along with them. So what did we find? Well, I think you know what we found, because I think you have already seen the let me just go to this one here. So this is what we found. First of all, in terms of overall cancer, we compared these people to Egypt. Now, we didn't want to compare them to Iraq because we weren't sure, well, because there's no data for Iraq to start with. But in any case, if the whole of Iraq is affected, then we're not going to find anything. So we looked at Egypt and at Jordan. So we used Egypt and Jordan as a control. And I think that was quite reasonable, similar populations genetically. And we found about a 4-fold excess in cancer in the group, and it was the incidence of childhood cancer was about 12 times the expected number. Now this is extraordinarily high. The famous Sellafield leukemia cluster that involved an enormous amount of money and a public inquiry and a huge load of hassle, and is still being talked about now, involved a 9-fold excess of childhood leukemia around the radioactive reprocessing plant in Sellafield in England. Okay? And we've got more than that. And these are highly statistically significant. You can see the p-value on this is enormously low. So the chances of this being a random thing is impossible. That's like several million. So we also found a range of increases in cancer of the sorts of cancer that are associated with radiation exposure at the time of the Hiroshima bomb. So when you look at the survivors of the Hiroshima bomb, that group, the cancers that had the highest incidence rate relative to controls were leukemias and lymphomas. And you can see here that we've got an astonishing level of leukemia, 38 times the expected number. This is unheard of. I have never heard of any epidemiological study ever in the world where you have seen a level of 38 times the amount of leukemia that you would expect. Even amongst the Hiroshima survivors, you're talking about 15 to 20 times the expected number. And on the basis of that, we've introduced all sorts of radiation risk legislation. And lymphoma also. Female breast cancer, we have almost a 10-fold excess of female breast cancer, and brain tumours. So these were all of the cancers that were being complained about in the media and by the doctors who were working in the area. So this is a real effect. We looked at infant mortality too, in order to follow up congenital malformations. There are technical reasons why congenital malformations are not easy to compare across countries, because in many countries, just if you have a finger missing or an extra finger, that becomes a congenital malformation. But with these people, you know, the congenital malformations are unusual and very bizarre. So we stuck with infant mortality, and we found there was about a 4-fold excess of infant mortality relative to the Egypt rate, and maybe 8 times compared to Kuwait. And this is getting worse, because in the last year of the study it has increased slightly. And the most important finding was the sex ratio. Although the cancer effects were extremely alarming and very graphic, the sex ratio was the one that pointed to a genetic damage which had occurred in 2004. Because the ratio of boys to girls is an absolutely standard indicator in human populations. There are always 1,050 boys to 1,000 girls born in human populations, unless something is attacking the DNA. Something is attacking the DNA preferentially picks off the boys, because they have an XY chromosome and the girls have an XX chromosome. So they have a redundant chromosome. So if you shoot out the X chromosome, the boy dies. If you shoot out the Y chromosome, the boy dies. But you shoot out the X chromosome on the girl, it can still survive, because it's got a spare one, you see. And we found a more serious sex ratio alteration in the Fallujah group than was in the Hiroshima survivors. So all of this points to some serious genetic damage event in 2004. And the reason I say 2004 is because the sex ratio before 2004 was okay. So if you plot the sex ratio before the 2004 and after, it was after 2004 that you got this perturbation, well, after 2005. So that allows 9 months for the gestation. So that's kind of really all I have to say about this. What I think we need to find is what caused this. Now, white phosphorus, people have mentioned white phosphorus. White phosphorus is not a mutagen. It's a very serious toxin. It knocks out your liver and it kills you, and it can kill the child in the womb. It can cause all sorts of nasty health effects. But primarily it is not something that attacks DNA and causes this level of mutation. Now, it could be some mutagen like poison gas. I mean, there's some mutagenic gases, like particularly mustard gas is a very serious mutagen, because it methylates the DNA. But if it had been mustard gas, and some people have suggested this in the internet, If it had been mustard gas, then it would still be there. It would be fine. You could still find it because it has very long environmental half-life. But also it has particularly easy to describe effects on human beings. So the doctors would have picked it up. You get blistering of the skin, you get lung damage, people choke to death because their lungs fill up with liquid. And because of the First World War and the effects in Kurdistan, the Saddam effects in Kurdistan, not Kurdistan, yes it was, in the mountains where that substance was used, it's quite easy to detect it, and nobody has found anything that suggests that it's mustard gas. So that really does leave us with uranium. Unless there's something that we've missed altogether, and we have some samples from there, and we've done elemental tests on them, and we're still working on this issue, it does seem as if it's the most likely candidate for this is uranium in some form or another. And one form could be this form I was talking about, where there's a weapon that produces neutrons and gamma rays from a fusion reaction involving hydrogen. And if that's the case, or deuterium, if that's the case, then it will produce significant quantities of tritium, which is a form of radioactive hydrogen. So that also should be there in the environment. But of course it's very difficult to measure this stuff. You know, I'm in the United Kingdom, and Fallujah is in Fallujah. It's a long way away, difficult to get samples and so on. But and also extremely difficult to find the money to do these analyses, because they're not cheap. The mass spectrometer necessary to look at the isotopic ratios of uranium costs approximately £70,000–80,000, and there are not very many of these in the world that we can use. People are very disinclined to do this work because they get into trouble with their governments. I mean, if it turns out that the University of Southampton, for example, has discovered that the Americans are using some new weapon, and it all goes all over the newspapers, then they don't get any more work. So, or at least they're frightened that they don't get any more work. So this is a very, very politicized area. It has to do with radiation, has to do with nuclear power, has to do with Chernobyl. There are echoes of this all over all throughout the entire political structure of the world. But it is an extremely important issue, because we are all of us, the people sitting here today, and our children and our grandchildren, we are all of us part of Fallujah. We are all of us citizens of Fallujah, because this stuff doesn't stay in Fallujah. I can tell you, we have measured in the 2003 war, we have measured this material in filters in the United Kingdom at the Atomic Weapons Establishment, and I wrote a paper about that in 2005. This stuff gets around the globe, and it causes serious effects. And the latest example of this, and I'll leave you with this, because it's a terrifying example, is a study done recently by a doctor in Jerusalem, who is working at a hospital in Jerusalem, has done a study of the sperm counts of people living in Israel in the last 10 years. And he has shown that there's a reduction in the sperm count over the last 10 years. The study was between 2004 and 2008, so it might be worse now, but he just published it in April. And he showed that there was a reduction in the sperm count of 40%. And he points out that if there's another reduction down to 20%, the population of that area will no longer be viable. That means that the human race is finished. That's another way of saying that. So we're talking about something that is not a minor problem, and it starts in Fallujah. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.